Hello everyone. Elizabeth here. Today, I want to share a part of my life that still resonates with me to this day. It happened when I was 47, after nearly 20 years of marriage with my husband, Jonathan. I was never an ambitious woman. Sure, I studied business and had a few promising opportunities, but once I got married, my priority became my family. I put my career on hold, choosing instead to raise our two children, Julia and Evan, and care for our home. To be honest, I was happy with that choice. My life revolved around my family, while Jonathan built his career and grew his business. In the early years, Jonathan was a kind, family-oriented man, my cherished partner. We both seemed content with the life we had chosen. At least, that's what I believed. But as the years passed, Jonathan became more and more absent. Our conversations dwindled to a mere good morning and a good night. He was always busy, constantly caught up in meetings and events. I told myself it was the price we paid for a comfortable life. While he buried himself in work, I poured my time into managing the household and raising the kids. I convinced myself it was normal. Just part of everyday life. But everything changed that day. Even now, it's painful to recall. I was tidying up the home office when I found an envelope in Jonathan's desk drawer. At first, I hesitated to open it. But something, a strange, gnawing instinct, compelled me to read it. The letter was filled with words of passion and affection, signed with a name I had never heard before, Lindsay. In that moment, it felt as though I had been slapped. The truth was staring right at me. I wondered how long I had been deceived. It felt as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. Everything I had devoted my life to suddenly felt like a lie. I didn't have the courage to confront him that day. I spent the next week trying to steady myself. I even questioned if I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted to understand why he had drifted away from us, why he had thrown away everything we had built for someone else. For days, I watched his every move. I saw him leave early in the morning, come home late at night, avoiding eye contact with me. A wave of anger surged in me, stronger than anything I had ever felt. Even his smile, his smallest gestures, they all felt hollow. The following week, the truth unraveled in a way I never expected. Jonathan admitted to the affair, and then, like a blade cutting through the air, he confessed that Lindsay was pregnant. I felt as though the walls around me collapsed. Yet what shattered me most wasn't the affair itself. It was the way he delivered the news. Cold, detached, and devoid of emotion, as if he were reading off a grocery list. He spoke of a new beginning, a life he planned to build with her and their unborn child, as if I were a chapter he had already closed. In that moment, I didn't just feel betrayed, I felt erased. I was no longer a partner, a wife, or the mother of his children. I had become a loose thread in the tapestry of his life, cut off and discarded. I was devastated. But for the sake of Julia and Evan, I forced myself to stand tall, even as my soul crumbled. Yet his confession wasn't the final blow. No, that came from Rose, Jonathan's mother. I always knew she thought of me as a woman without ambition. But after dedicating decades of my life to my family, I naively hoped for some shred of solidarity from her. Instead, she stood firmly by her son's side, treating Lindsay like the rightful heir to the family legacy. She welcomed this young, pregnant woman as if she were a savior, as if I were nothing more than a relic of the past. In their eyes, I wasn't just betrayed by Jonathan. I was dismissed by his entire family. I faced a betrayal so profound, it felt like drowning in a sea with no rescue in sight. I was alone, cast aside like an obstacle in their grand future. That moment became a defining point in my life. I lost count of the sleepless nights I spent staring at the ceiling, haunted by questions that looped endlessly in my mind. Where did I go wrong? Could I have done anything differently? Anger and heartbreak coiled together inside me like a storm. But beneath the pain, something else began to stir. An ember of defiance. I had poured every ounce of myself into my family, yet I knew that I could no longer crumble for their sake. I had to become strong. Not just for Julia and Evan, but for me. I didn't know what the future held, but I made myself one promise: I would never be trampled again. Rose, with her ever unyielding gaze, had always found me lacking in some way. In the early days of my marriage, I tried so hard to earn her approval, bowing my head and offering respect at every turn. But it was futile. To her, I was nothing more than a weak, ambitionless woman who had resigned herself to the life of a housewife. She never understood that my sacrifices were acts of love, not signs of weakness. She saw life through a ruthless lens of power and success, and with each passing year, that worldview hardened her even more. And with each passing year, her convictions hardened like stone. Jonathan, as his income grew, slowly began to absorb her way of thinking. The devotion I had poured into him and our children, he began to see as mere compromise. In his mind, I had become nothing more than just a wife. Everything we had built together as a family seemed to lose its worth in his eyes. That truth cut deeper than any wound. Every time Jonathan came home, the invisible chasm between us grew wider. I could see it in his gaze. He no longer looked at me with warmth. Instead, he saw only the things I hadn't accomplished, the person I hadn't become. And Lindsay, her presence was salt on that open wound. Rose, in her cruel, imperious way, whispered to anyone who would listen that Lindsay's child was the true heir to Jonathan's legacy. She spoke of this baby as though it were a blessing, a grand continuation of the family line. Her words pierced my heart like daggers. It felt as though Julia and Evan, the children I had raised with love and devotion, were being dismissed as unworthy. Rose treated them like mere background players in a story where the unborn child was the star. It created a war within me. How could a grandmother place such cruel distinctions between her own grandchildren? Rose's influence over Jonathan was insidious. She had mastered the art of manipulation, feeding his ego and positioning herself as his unwavering ally. She made him believe that my very existence was an anchor holding him back from his true potential. Jonathan began to look at me with quiet contempt. A gaze that wasn't truly his, but a reflection of Rose's unspoken judgment. I found myself excluded from their conversations, their plans. I became a shadow in my own home, invisible, irrelevant. They mapped out a future that no longer included me, and the pain of that realization was unbearable. The children felt it too. Julia, who had always been close to her father, sensed the shift most acutely. It was as though his love for her had been replaced with an awkward, unspoken distance. Rose's poisonous influence seeped into every corner of our lives, and I saw the disappointment in my children's eyes. I never wanted them to experience the sting of rejection, yet I felt powerless to shield them from Jonathan and Rose's growing indifference. The tension in our home was suffocating. Rose, with her cold, expressionless face, always knew exactly how to stoke the fires of my anxiety. She would hint, ever so subtly, that Lindsay's youth and ambition were exactly what Jonathan needed to feel alive again, to rewrite his story. Each of her venomous words chipped away at me, draining my strength. She wanted me gone, wanted me to surrender the place she believed I didn't deserve. She wanted me to hand over my home, my life, as though I had no right to hold on to it. With Rose's support behind him, it felt as though Jonathan was merely waiting for me to disappear. Inside me, there was a raging battle. A part of me wanted to fight for the family I had dedicated my life to. But another part feared what the fight might do to my children. Some nights, I could hear Julia crying softly in her room. Evan, once full of life, had grown withdrawn, his cheerful nature fading away. I had to be strong for them. But the weight of it all began to take a toll on me. Insomnia set in. I lost my appetite. The weight fell from me until I barely recognized the reflection in the mirror. Friends reached out, worried about my frail appearance, but I was too ashamed to tell them the full truth. And then, when I felt I was at the breaking point, a lifeline appeared. It was my sister, Jennifer. When Jennifer found out what was happening, she didn't hesitate. She acted immediately. She introduced me to a lawyer and gave me advice on how to gain financial independence. Her support felt like a hand pulling me up from the darkest abyss. Jennifer didn't just give me practical solutions, she gave me something far greater. A new perspective. She helped me see that this wasn't the end of my story. It could be a new beginning. Slowly, I began to rediscover myself. For my children, yes, but above all, for me. Looking back now, I see how that experience utterly transformed me. The obedient, self-sacrificing Elizabeth was gone. In her place stood a stronger, self-sufficient woman. My story wasn't over. I was just beginning a new chapter. Life has a way of teaching us that the deepest wounds can lead to the greatest lessons. And above all, I learned that my worth isn't determined by anyone else. Only I have the right to define it. Time passed, slowly yet steadily, like a river carving through stone. Rose's influence over everyone felt like poison seeping into the air, tainting everything it touched. The relationships that once felt genuine had become warped and twisted. It no longer felt like I was fighting against a single betrayal. It felt as though I was fighting against a system that saw me as disposable, a pawn to be sacrificed. Every day became a quiet battle. I stood firm not just for my own dignity, but to show my children that a mother cannot be so easily cast aside. And then, like a thunderclap in a clear sky, Jonathan's death arrived. The news came one afternoon, hitting me like a blunt force. My body felt paralyzed, unable to process what I had just heard. It felt like part of me had been locked away in denial. I had never wished for this. Not even after everything he had done. Despite my anger, there was still a bond, fragile and worn, but there nonetheless. Our shared memories, the life we had built together, they still clung to me. That bond had frayed over time, but its remnants remained. In that moment, I realized something undeniable. Jonathan had always been a part of my life, and in some way, a part of me. And in the face of his loss, I thought only of my children. How would this impact them? How could I remain strong for them? The funeral was a true test of my strength. There was a strange tension in the air. A clash between sympathy from some and the cold, judgmental stares of others. Even in death, the shadow of his betrayal lingered. I held Julia and Evan as they grieved their father, trying to be their anchor. But I knew they were still struggling to comprehend everything that had happened in the past months. And then, the most painful moment of that day unfolded. Rose walked in, and Lindsay was with her. Lindsay stood there without a shred of shame. Her pregnancy was undeniable, and she rested her hand on her stomach like it was a trophy. Rose stood beside her, radiating a quiet pride. For a moment, I thought my heart might stop. There she was, Lindsay. The woman who symbolized the ultimate betrayal, standing at this solemn moment of farewell with the child Jonathan had never dared to tell me about. I had known she was pregnant, but seeing her there in the flesh was like stepping into a waking nightmare. Rose, for her part, seemed utterly unaffected by the chaos her presence caused. She held her head high and walked beside Lindsay as if parading her approval for all to see. To Rose, this was the heir to the legacy she treasured. And she made no attempt to hide it. The humiliation I felt in that moment was soul-crushing. I wanted to turn and run, to escape the suffocating shame. But something inside me wouldn't let me move. Julia and Evan stood beside me, confused and hurting. I couldn't let them see me break. I took a deep breath and held Julia's hand as she stared at Lindsay, her eyes a storm of confusion and pain. It hurt more than words could express. Evan's fists clenched, as though he was ready to confront her, but I placed my hand on his arm to stop him. I wasn't sure if I was holding him back or trying to rein in my own anger. Lindsay's presence at the funeral was like a stain on the day of mourning, impossible to ignore. Rose introduced her to the other relatives as though presenting the newest addition to the family. She acted as though Lindsay had more of a right to be there than I did. I watched in silence, taking in every movement, every exchanged glance. The resentment inside me burned hotter with each passing second. At that moment, I understood something that had eluded me before. To Rose, I had never truly been part of the family. She wasn't there just to support Lindsay, she was there to remind me of my place. I had fought for so long to hold on to my dignity and preserve what remained of our family. But seeing Rose and Lindsay there, I felt something shift inside me. The pain crystallized into something new, strength. I had tried to understand, to reconcile, but at that moment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not let them trample over me or my children ever again. Jonathan was gone, but I was still there standing. And I would not allow Rose's manipulations or his mistress's existence to dictate my children's future. During the service, I remained silent, but inside me, something powerful began to take shape. A resolve, a vow to fight for myself and my children, to make sure Jonathan's death would never be used as an excuse to erase our history. At the end, Rose and Lindsay left together, a haunting foreshadowing of the battles yet to come. The fight for justice and dignity had only just begun. In the days after the funeral, my life became a whirlwind I never could have anticipated. I was still trying to process Jonathan's death and Lindsay's devastating presence when I received a call from the family lawyer. He said we needed to discuss Jonathan's will. To be honest, the thought of finances and inheritance hadn't even crossed my mind. Everything felt surreal, like I was drowning in a sea of grief. But I knew that sooner or later, I would have to face it, for my children's sake. So I gathered every ounce of strength I had and walked into the lawyer's office. I thought that after everything I'd been through, nothing could shock me anymore. How wrong I was. As the contents of the will were read aloud, my world shattered all over again. Jonathan had included Lindsay and her unborn child in the inheritance. It was the final blow. But the cruelest part wasn't the inclusion itself. It was the cold, calculating precision behind it. Jonathan had ensured that this unborn baby would have the same rights as Julia and Evan. It was as if, long before I discovered the truth, he had already decided that our family was destined to be replaced. In that moment, I understood something gut-wrenching. He had been rewriting our lives long before I ever found out. Naturally, Rose seized the opportunity when she learned the details of the will. She wasted no time reaffirming her position, making sure I knew exactly where I stood. With chilling indifference, she reminded me that Lindsay and the baby were now part of the family. She spoke as if I was expected to accept it all without question, with a voice so calm it sent shivers down my spine. To her, my pain, and my children's pain, was irrelevant. Rose always knew what she wanted and how to secure it. To her, the child Lindsay carried was the true heir to the legacy she revered. I knew this fight would be brutal. I wasn't just fighting a mistress who'd latched onto Jonathan for her own gain. I was also battling a mother-in-law who was determined to erase every remnant of the life Jonathan and I had built together. Julia and Evan felt the same betrayal I did. They were angry, confused, and hurt. I will never forget the look in Julia's eyes. The way she tried to understand how the father she had once admired could choose to abandon her for someone else. Evan, always more volatile, was consumed by his rage. He wanted to challenge everything and push Lindsay out as if that could restore our family's honor. I wanted to be their pillar of strength, their unwavering support. But inside, I was breaking. How could I explain to them that the man who had once been their hero had chosen to leave us in such a cruel, deliberate way? The days that followed were filled with bitter arguments and endless meetings with lawyers. Every conversation was like navigating a minefield. I didn't want that innocent baby to suffer. After all, the baby had done nothing wrong. But accepting that Jonathan, whom I had loved and devoted my life to, could dismiss our shared history and put me on the same level as a near stranger felt unbearable. It was as though my entire life had been erased, wiped away like a name scrawled in the sand before an approaching wave. I felt like I had only ever been a placeholder, a wife to keep until a younger replacement came along. Rose attended every meeting with the same icy demeanor, calculating each word as though it was a blade aimed to cut me down. It was a silent war, but one where every look and every pause was a battle in itself. Yet slowly, I realized something. I couldn't let her win. Lindsay, she carried herself with a smugness that was hard to stomach. She acted as if she was entitled to everything, without an ounce of regret or self-doubt. Her pregnancy, the will, and Rose's unwavering support, all of it played in her favor, and she knew it. She moved with the calm arrogance of someone who believed they'd already won. As much as I hated to admit it, she was clever. She knew exactly how to play her cards, aligning herself with Rose and pretending as if we didn't even exist. It deepened my contempt for her and the entire situation. I wasn't just fighting one enemy. I was battling two ruthless opponents who didn't care about the pain they inflicted. The resentment I felt began to transform into something deeper. This fight wasn't about Jonathan's money or his legacy anymore. It became a battle for my dignity and for my children's rightful place in this world. I was determined that Julia and Evan would receive what they deserved, that they would not be erased or dismissed because of someone else's betrayal. I wouldn't let the memories we built together be rewritten by Rose and Lindsay's ambition. So, I sought the help of a lawyer who specialized in family disputes. At our very first meeting, I laid everything bare. I needed to protect my children's rights and preserve what was left of our history. But something inside me whispered that Lindsay wasn't as innocent as she pretended to be. That suspicion led me to hire a private investigator. The following weeks were exhausting. A blur of hearings, meetings, and the overwhelming fear that I was fighting a battle far larger than I could handle. Each encounter with Rose was like stepping into a frost-covered room where every breath threatened to freeze in my lungs. She maintained a look of disdain mixed with superiority, as though this whole fight was nothing but a futile whim on my part. But for me, it wasn't a whim. It was everything. I knew the baby was innocent, but I also knew there was more to this story than met the eye. Lindsay hadn't just stumbled into Jonathan's life by chance. She had timed her entrance perfectly, taking advantage of every opportunity, willing to do whatever it took to secure her share of his fortune. Somehow, I knew if I let my guard down, she would take everything she wanted and destroy us in the process. Then, the investigator's findings began to trickle in, confirming my fears. Lindsay had a history of relationships with wealthy older men, always seeking to gain something from them. It became clear that her pregnancy wasn't a coincidence. It was a strategy. The puzzle pieces clicked into place, and for the first time, I felt like I had a weapon of my own. But none of it seemed to faze Rose. If anything, her resolve only hardened. She defended Lindsay with unflinching coldness, making it clear that as long as Lindsay was the mother of her grandchild, her past was irrelevant. Rose was obsessed with the idea of her grandchild as the true heir and had no intention of backing down. It dawned on me that this wasn't just an inheritance dispute. It was an obsession that had consumed Rose completely. And I knew then that she wouldn't stop, no matter what. And then, the focus of the battle shifted. It was no longer just about money. It became a fight for the custody of the unborn baby. Rose began to talk openly about raising her grandchild as a rightful member of the family, subtly implying that Lindsay might not be a fit mother. I knew she would do anything to push Lindsay aside and seize control. And in that moment, I realized this was my chance. I filed for legal custody, claiming that I would protect the child from the ambitions of its mother and Rose's manipulative grip. It was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made. I was promising to raise a child born of betrayal. But this was bigger than my personal pain. It was about protecting the integrity of my family. Every hearing felt like a war, and the emotional toll grew heavier by the day. Rose and I faced each other with unrelenting determination. She wanted control over everything, and I couldn't afford to surrender. I often asked myself if this fight was worth it. But when I looked into my children's faces and saw the pain they were enduring, I found the strength to keep going. Evan stood by my side, showing loyalty and strength that moved me to my core. Julia suffered quietly, but I knew she longed for justice as much as her brother did. I wanted them to see that our family had dignity and that not even Rose could erase our history or replace us so easily. Meanwhile, Lindsay began using the baby as a bargaining chip, threatening to relinquish custody in exchange for generous financial compensation. To her, the child wasn't a symbol of love. It was her insurance policy, her tool for negotiation. It was sickening to see Rose entertain the idea of negotiating with her about the grandchild. Lindsay painted herself as a victim, as though all she wanted was to protect the baby. But I knew better. Her loyalty was fleeting, and all she truly cared about was how much she could gain from the situation. The battle for the inheritance and the baby's custody grew fiercer with each passing day. Rose was willing to use any means to win, and she was blind to the destruction Lindsay was causing. But I was resolute. I was determined to protect everything Jonathan and I had built, and I would fight until the very end to ensure my children didn't suffer further injustice. After months of relentless conflict, the tide began to turn. The private investigator uncovered indisputable evidence about Lindsay's true intentions. She had been secretly in contact with another man who was helping her plan a new life funded by the money she hoped to receive. This man had assisted her in similar situations in the past. The evidence made it clear Lindsay wasn't a helpless woman in love. She was a calculated strategist, and her relationship with Jonathan had been part of a long con for financial security. Armed with this information, I presented it to the court. For the first time, I felt the scales of justice tip in my favor. When the evidence was revealed, Lindsay's facade crumbled. No one saw it coming. It was a shocking twist. Even Rose, who had defended Lindsay so fervently, was forced to accept the truth. It was excruciating for her, but her obsession with the legacy she had idealized forced her to change her stance. Rose used her influence to push Lindsay out and secure her grandchild's future. She ensured the baby would be raised far away from the hands of a mother who saw her own child as a pawn in a game. It was an unlikely alliance, but in that moment, I realized that even Rose had come to understand how dangerous it would be to leave the baby in Lindsay's care. With Rose now on my side, I was able to convince the judge that my home was the safest place for the child. Lindsay, realizing she was cornered, began negotiating her exit. Of course, she asked for financial compensation, but it was nowhere near the outrageous demands she had made before. It was as if her arrogance had vanished overnight. In the end, she took the money and agreed to relinquish custody without a fight. It became painfully clear that all she had ever wanted was a way to escape responsibility and live in comfort. She left town without looking back. There was no dramatic farewell, no final showdown. Lindsay walked away the same way she had arrived. Alone, with cold, empty eyes that cared for no one but herself. When I learned she had gone, I felt an odd sense of relief. Yes, there was pain, but it signaled the end of one chapter. Lindsay had caused so much suffering, but her departure symbolized a new beginning. With the shadow of betrayal lifted, we finally had the chance to rebuild what was left of our family. Taking custody of the baby was a decision that weighed heavily on my soul, but I knew it was the right one. He was an innocent life, a new soul who should not bear the sins of the adults around him. Julia and Evan struggled at first to accept his presence, but in time, we built a new rhythm, a fragile harmony stitched together with patience and understanding. No matter how difficult it was, I made it clear that our responsibility was to give this child a home filled with love and safety, not one haunted by the mistakes of his parents. It was the least we could do to honor our own history. To my surprise, Rose stayed. She never apologized, and the wounds between us remained deep. But I came to understand that in her own way, she was trying to make amends by devoting herself to her grandson. She put aside her obsession with control and power, revealing, for the first time, a glimmer of humanity. That experience changed all of us in ways we never could have imagined. People don't change completely, but I learned that extreme circumstances have a way of forcing us to confront painful truths about ourselves. The baby grew up surrounded by love. Not just mine and the children's, but Rose's, as flawed and complicated as it was. Justice had been served, but it came at the cost of a journey that left permanent scars on us all. Yet, I learned that even after betrayal and devastation, a family can be rebuilt. Most importantly, I discovered that the strength to move forward had been within me all along, waiting for its moment. Over time, Rose and I found an unexpected peace. This child gave us a new reason to protect the future. Our differences never fully disappeared. Rose remained the pragmatic, resolute woman she had always been. But something within her had shifted. Perhaps it was the fear of losing her last tie to her son. Or maybe it was a belated reckoning with the suffering her actions had caused. Whatever the reason, she became a thoughtful grandmother. She never voiced her regrets, but her actions spoke louder than any apology. Slowly, we began to heal, not as enemies, but as survivors of the same storm, each carrying our own scars. This experience left an indelible mark on us all. I often reflect on everything we went through, the betrayals, the manipulations, and the unspoken power struggles woven into every decision and conversation. Loyalty and love are tested to their limits in moments like these, but I learned that the truth of a family cannot be denied. No matter how painful, family forces us to face who we really are and offers us a chance to change so that future generations suffer less for our mistakes. Jonathan and Rose lived by the notion of a legacy, and it became a chain that bound and blinded them to what truly mattered. In the end, that relentless pursuit of control destroyed more than it ever secured. Looking back, I recognize how much ambition shaped this story. Lindsay's motives were driven by greed, not love. In a different way, Rose was also led by her blind desire to preserve the family's fortune and name above all else. We all became victims of that obsession, whether directly or indirectly. But through it all, I learned what was truly worth protecting: dignity, mutual respect, and, above all, the happiness of my children. When I chose to protect that baby, I realized that, flawed as my actions may have been, I was working to rebuild the integrity of our family. Jonathan's betrayal, Rose's hidden schemes, Lindsay's lies. All of them were like poison, eroding the trust we had taken for granted. Julia and Evan bore the shadows of that trauma, and they had to learn, far too quickly, the fragility of human nature and the importance of justice. But if anything good came from all of this, it was the understanding that no matter how painful, living in truth is always better than surviving beneath a web of lies. With the child by our side, Rose and I shared an unspoken promise. We would give him a different future, free from the burdens of legacy and power struggles. We wanted him to grow up not as a pawn in someone else's game, but as a boy who knew the warmth of love and the freedom to be himself. That choice became our greatest lesson, a deliberate effort to break the cycle of mistakes passed down through generations. When I looked at him, I saw the possibility of a new story, a beginning guided by genuine bonds. And so, our story became a reflection of universal struggles: loyalty versus ambition, power versus compassion, and the path to redemption. The pain we endured was not in vain. It gave us a second chance to build a true family, one bound not by control or legacy, but by love and truth. And finally, I discovered a strength I didn't know I had. Now, that strength belongs not to my past, but to the future. A future guided by compassion and justice.